afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming here for the second last session of the winter iteration of the first thought strand of the Galway International Arts Festival. There is a mouthful and a half. And this session is dealing with what is probably the most pressing issue in our country at the moment, the issue of homelessness and housing. We had a large panel here during the summer, chaired by David McCullough, with many fabulous experts, to try and figure out what is wrong with this, that we can't seem to be able to build houses. And they professed themselves baffled that in the 1930s we were able to build 30,000 houses a year, 10 years after a civil war, and when we were flat broke. And now, when we're one of the richest countries in the world, comparatively speaking, we cannot seem to get it together to just build bloody houses. Anyway, today we're looking at the sharp end of that failure, which is homelessness, and the people who deal with that problem. And it is a multifaceted, complicated problem that now afflicts something like 10,000 of our citizens here. So to moderate our session this afternoon, we have Professor Daniel Carey, who is Director of the Moore Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at NUIG. The Moore Institute is a wonderful place that engages in many interesting projects. Dan has published widely on intellectual history, colonialism, and economic thought. He's a board member of the Irish Research Council, and he has served as chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance from 2014 to 16. In a previous life, before these glittering academic achievements, he was a journalist with the Times-Picayune, beautifully called, in New Orleans, where he wrote in the 1980s about homeless families, and that is a subject which has always been close to his heart. So we're very pleased that he can do this for us today. He is going to be talking to Alice Leahy, who most of you, I'm sure, will know. She's a national figure in terms of her long-term advocacy for the homeless, and is listened to with enormous respect by everybody. And we're also delighted to have Donna O'Neill, who's the manager of COPE, which is the Galway Homeless Service. So she'll be able to bring to this discussion a local dimension and tell us how things are here. So please welcome Professor Dan Carey.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Katrina, for the introduction, and thank you both for being here. As the days become short, the weather turns cold, the dampness is more raw and biting, we naturally draw in. The comforts of home become more essential and pronounced. Places of warmth and intimacy and shelter are obviously prized. Public attention turns now more than at any other time in the year towards these kinds of questions, and particularly as the holidays approach. There are people who have dedicated their lives to alleviating the problems of homelessness, of those who don't have access to those comforts that we particularly prize at this time of year. And it's an opportunity to talk to two exceptional people who have broad experience, and I'll introduce them now. Alice Leahy, who founded the trust, it's now called after her, Alice Leahy Trust, in 1975, has dedicated herself to working with the homeless for well over 40 years. At this point, she was born in Tipperary. She trained as a nurse and midwife and worked in those professions for many years. She's had a number of awards and recognition, and Katrina was alluding to her public profile. Most recently, in fact, I think in the last week, she was named as the Irish Red Cross's Humanitarian of the Year. And she's recently published, it came out in October, this book, The Stars Are Our Only Warmth, a memoir. So we'll be able to take advantage of some of the reflection that Alice has done in conjunction with writing that book and the career that she has made in this important space. Donna O'Neill has worked with the homeless in Galway for over 20 years. She's originally from Dublin herself, and for the last 15 years, she has managed COPE Galway Fairgreen Hostel. It's near the train station, of course, and she's the manager of the men's service there. So I have a number of questions, and by all means, people should intervene and draw attention to themselves if they want to comment or ask questions, but we'll have a time towards the end as well to do that. Alice, I thought I'd begin with you, and partly thinking about the occasion of your memoir, and to ask you, where does the vocation come from for you?
I suppose I wouldn't call it a vocation, maybe, but I think from my childhood, because I grew up in rural Ireland a long time ago, and we always looked out for elderly people, people living alone. We used to visit people who had no visitors in the then county home. And if the travellers didn't come, it was the Delaney family, if they didn't come at a certain time of the year, we'd be worried about them. So I think, and my mother was a founder member of Country Markets, and I grew up in a very big estate. It wasn't our estate, we just had a small little house on the estate. But of course I felt it was my estate and I loved every blade of grass in it. But I, having grown up in that type of environment, when I went to Dublin then, I would love to have been a vet, but we couldn't afford it. And I became a nurse. And nursing in those days, I've written about it in the book because people wouldn't believe what it was like. It was, we were so institutionalized, it was all women, and it was very, very different. And then I got involved with Voluntary Services International, and we visited the slums. I trained as a midwife, and I can still see the mothers coming in every year. It was their annual holiday, and then mothers could stay for about a week. And then I did some district midwifery, and you kind of saw the real poverty. And I suppose I felt there was something I should do about it. And then I went to London. I was the youngest ward sister in the country, I believe. I don't know if that's true or not. And they sent me to the London hospital to look at intensive care units. And I came back and I set up an intensive care unit with the consultants. And then when I said I was leaving to go and work in Simon, one of the consultants looked at me wearing glasses, and he said, without a smile on his face, and he said, well, I'll make an appointment for you to see the psychiatrist, because I was considered to be totally mad. So I mean, there are lots of things, but I think it's in my genes, I think.
And was there, I mean, that conversation that you described with the skeptical doctor, I mean, what were the attitudes like in this is 1975 then, was it, or 74?
No, it was before that. It was in the late 60s.
Okay.
But when I said I was leaving, well, you see, when you trained as a nurse, then you stayed in the nurse's home, and which I think was probably a good thing at the time. But nurses were trained not to show their emotions, not to get involved. But then you got to know the families. And a very simple thing about nursing in those days, you had to have a definite space between beds. And now, if they could get two people into a bed, they would. You know, it's appalling. And we also worked very closely with the domestic staff. And most of those women were women who came out of the institutions. Yeah. And I remember one day, they worked so hard. And I remember one day, one of the women, and she had this big buffer. It was like a sweeping brush maybe, with a big wooden head on it and a piece of felt on the end of it. And she was cleaning away, and the consultant, of course, they were all men too, walked by, and totally ignored her, and she flung it after him. But the sad thing was, I never saw her after that. So you just wonder. And you got to know some of those women, and I came across some of them later in places like the Regina Chaley Hostel. And you saw what was happening in the institutions. But I was always questioning things, and I'm also was somebody who said, if there's something you can do, do it. Yeah. Rather than sitting back and letting somebody else do it.
Yeah. And so for you, was the transition to working with the homeless, was it kind of the premise was healthcare? Would that have been the point of transition, or do you see it in different terms?
No, I felt my nursing should be put to good use. And I felt when I went to Simon, I mean, it was chaotic. We lived in a condemned building. You shared the same food, the same accommodation. I woke up one night and I felt a weight on my feet, and there was a poor homeless man, drunk as a lord, lying across my feet. And there was a wonderful journalist at the time, Tom McPhail, who worked with the Evening Press. And the workers there were wonderful. Many of them went on to become involved maybe in politics, journalism, civil servants, the lot. But it was a very different world. People wouldn't believe what it was like in those days. And then I felt as a nurse, it was the dirt that you could do something about it. You had people coming out of hospital with prescriptions. I'm sure, Donna, you would see some of this. And there were doctors then who wanted to help. And so when I left Simon, I went over to Yorkshire. My best friend from nursing days set up a very successful nursing agency, and I went over to do private nursing. And I worked in the steel foundry, and I remember in the steel foundry I had no industrial training, nothing. And I remember, I can tell you, you'd pray if you're in the middle of a steel foundry and you're hoping something won't happen, because what would you do? And a letter came through. She was married to a GP, and a letter came through the door. You know how you get all this stuff through the door. And I saw where a report had been done by CHAR, the Campaign for the Homeless and Rootless in London. And I said, well, look, we could do something about that. And a group of doctors, in fact, one of them has Galway connections, Kieran Daly, I think he was cardiologist here, and Philip Kennedy. They were two UCD doctors. They worked voluntarily with me. And we visited. It was the first time a doctor and a nurse visited people in broken down cars, under the trees, under the bushes. And we hear about people doing it now, but we did it then. And I did report then on the medical problems of people who were homeless. I presented to the health board. And then we set up Trust. And in an ideal world, we shouldn't be there. And we see the same problems today. And
Donna, maybe we could talk about your experience and how you came to this this role that you've had for many years now. What's your life story in this connection? Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for being here, and congratulations to Alice on her recent award, and for NUIG donating the proceeds of today to COPE Galway. That's really important. It'll go a long way to helping services. Just listening to Alice, it was really interesting because we have a lot of similarities, not just a shared birthday today and homelessness. I too wanted to be a vet.
did you?
I did, yeah. I just wasn't smart enough to do it. And a dynamic mother, as you mentioned there, it's your mother. I grew up in inner city Dublin, so that's our difference. And I would have been physically between two hostels, the Old Back Lane and the Ivy. Yeah. So the child I used to play in the park, and what I know now is I seen homeless men. And I also had very progressively thinking parents. They were very kind people. And that we too had a traveller family who used to come to us for water, for filling their kettles. So it was always impressed upon me to be good to others and not to judge. But in regards to homelessness itself, I kind of fell into it by accident. It wasn't really something I had planned. I initially started off with working with unaccompanied homeless children and mothers and their children who are experiencing homelessness. And I also worked with children on their own. I worked in a domestic violence refuge, and then I worked with the men. And I discovered I loved it. I felt it was the one area I was really making a difference to people's lives. I felt really connected to the client group. And I've just stayed with it for 15 years and learned and enjoyed it.
I do not think you're moving on.
Not yet, not yet, I enjoy it. One of the things that both of you have emphasized in different contexts is taking a non-judgmental approach. And I wonder if you might say something more about that and of the importance of that principle and how it plays out in practice. Why is that significant in the relationships that you build? Well, I suppose the mantra we would have, or I would have always had, is never judge, assess. Because when you judge somebody, you're already putting your own judgment on top of it again. And it blinds you from the real person. You're actually looking at an extension of your thoughts, is my belief around judgment. I don't like people judging me. I live in a free world, so I should be entitled to do and be what I want to be. So I feel I have no right to judge anybody else. I can only judge, I feel I can only judge in a way that I either can challenge or I help. And with homelessness, I've decided to help. Yeah. And how about you, Alice?
Yeah, I think it's very important not to judge people. And I think particularly these days, because the way services have developed, it's very much now about you judge somebody, you plan something for them, and if they don't work to your plan, they're not seen as successful. And I think, too, when you're working closely with people, you kind of say, well, that could be me. You know, and I think we're in grave danger of judging people, because you never know. I mean, I've seen come across the most amazing people in my life. People who've been in prison, people who've been in institutions, people who got their life together. But you have no right to judge people. And a friend of mine, Dr. Maurice Gorey, and Maurice always said, the only possession some of the people we meet have is their personal history. And yet their personal history is being exposed, it's challenged. And one man we knew who died by the daughter, and he said to us once, he said, if I answered all the questions I'm asked, I would need a solicitor with me. So I think people who are very broken, they do challenge us to look at our own vulnerability. And you learn from them, don't
Absolutely.
you? Their enormous strength and that. And I think people who judge people, they miss out really on a great gift that they can share.
Yeah. It's interesting you use the word vulnerability, because I know it comes up in your book as that's something that you can offer to those that you're working with. How is that done in practice? Is it just something that you intuitively understand about building relationships? I don't, Donna, if you see that as important as well.
Absolutely. I think a lot of it is intuitive, but it's intuitive in that for me, it's recognizing myself first. I don't think I need to be authentic and honest about myself and my reaction to people. But yes, I would see a lot of our client group as incredibly vulnerable people.
Yeah. But it's your own vulnerability too that I think seems to be part of the conversation and the relationship that's built.
Well, it's to touch into your own. We're all human. We all have our even here today is scary.
Yeah.
But as Alice said, people who are homeless have to constantly answer questions about their lives, and yet they have to try and hide and not be too public. So my vulnerability, while it's there, it's nothing compared to what people go through every single day of their lives in order just to exist, not to even live, just to exist. So to me, I try and keep it in proportion. Yeah. But certainly you do need your own vulnerability.
I often say to people when I meet a group, any kind of group like this, I always say, look, none of us here asked to be born. We didn't choose our parents. We didn't choose this. We didn't choose where we were born. And a lot of the people we meet, they really have had terrible trauma in their lives, no opportunities, things beyond their control. And really, I think none of us spend enough time looking at how lucky we are and how sad life can be for other people. Yeah. And maybe helping other people who maybe we're inclined to judge homeless people as if they're useless, but they're not. Many of them are very, very broken people. And many of them challenge us, I think, all of us.
And how does it, in terms of the building relationships, how do you manage that? Because I assume that part of the challenge is that, or maybe it's just is a question of how do you develop friendships, or how do you manage that relationship? You're dealing with people who are vulnerable, who cannot always help themselves, who may temporarily benefit from what you're able to provide, and then find themselves in difficulty again. So, how is that side of things managed for you both?
Me again? Okay.
You lost the topic.
That's all right. I think building the relationship is the absolute foundation. If you don't have the relationship in place, then all you're doing is providing perhaps a roof over somebody's head. But that's not good enough. You need to be able to, what we always say is in the Fairgreen is that we're not your friends, but we're very friendly. We show great warmth, equality, interest. We share our lives because we work in a residential service. We live with people. So it's a 24/7. So if you don't have a positive, happy, professional relationship, then it's a waste of time having that amount of trained staff to work with people. Because you can be educated to work with people, but you can really be taught how to work with people as well. And it really is just down to treating people with warmth, respect. And you can still, our role is to set the boundaries. If boundaries need to be set, that's where we come in our professionalism. But because you have boundaries doesn't mean that you're inaccessible. As you said earlier, you have to be accessible as a service, as a worker, as a human being.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think you have to be professional. You do have to have boundaries, but that doesn't stop you being human and working with people. And I think it helps people to know that there are boundaries, because if you're creating dependency, you're not doing anyone any favours. And it is all about building relationships, and that takes time and energy. And I must tell you a story of a man we knew who stayed in the Ivy, because we work from the basement of the Ivy, and so we're very familiar with that area. But this man lived in the Ivy Hostel for years, and he then disappeared, and he came down to Galway. And he decided, I think the Galway races were on, but he was looking after animals on Commonage. And he suddenly got very lonely, and he wanted to come back to the city. So he came back up to Dublin. And of course, when he came back up, he couldn't get accommodation. And he was very frightened. So he ran in the door and he said, "Is she here? Is she here?" And nobody knew who he was or what was going on. And then he said, will you ring my family? And we said, "No, you ring your family yourself." And it was just that he knew there was a familiar face. And that means a lot to people. I think that there's somebody there they can give out to, or they can ask for advice, and that's important. We all need relationships.
I'm sure the part of it is also having a lot of tolerance. I mean, because people are living, by definition, under conditions of immense stress. And as we all know, we're not at our best, put it that way. So is that something that you have to try to see beyond those moments of stress and how they manifest themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, we would be trained, we're very highly trained, in order to run our services effectively. So yes, you have to have a tolerant nature, but you have to step back. Again, we're professionals, so you have to step back. That's that person's trauma, it's not my trauma, but I just have to work them through it safely, make them safe, the building safe, and be there for them when that trauma is over, that moment of anger or that moment of fear is over.
I think it's important to say too, it is hard work. It's very hard work, and a lot of people think you can dip into this work and you can pat somebody on the shoulder and solve their problems. And it is a worry a concern I would have, a lot of maybe younger people, if there aren't support services there to help them. Because sometimes people think, I mean, when we started out, we thought we would have homelessness solved, in 6 months. And you learn as you go along, and I think there's an obligation on those of us who are around for a while to support and help others who want to get involved. But there is a real challenge now in our work, because we're a day facility, and some months we meet people from 26 different countries who are homeless on the streets of our capital city. And to look at those people, they're exactly the same as, the photographs of people. RTE did a very good programme a number of years ago on people living on their own in London, and you have them in New York. So we would be meeting people who came over here with a dream of a better future, that they could make money and send it back to educate their families. And they're homeless in our cities. So you have to make sure there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's none of that. So, it's hard work.
And presumably that's been part of the social change in Ireland, the demographic change in Ireland. So that must be a big difference between, say, 1975 and
well, when we started working with people who were homeless, everyone came from the island of Ireland. And they were men and women, but most of them came out of the institutions. And I can never remember seeing any of them smile. They were sad, broken people. But we didn't pry into their affairs, because we felt it was up to them to tell us. Now, whether that was right or wrong, or if we could have done more at the time, you just never know. But now it has changed dramatically.
And do you find, Donna, the same demographic change in Galway, or is it?
Yes, we were exactly as Alice described. People come over, same dream as we had. When we went to England, it didn't work out, and they remain. why they remain it for different reasons. Economically, maybe they can't get home, but there is the big shame thing as well.
Yeah.
And some people are stuck. So yeah, we have
Yeah.
some language difficulties within the hostel at the moment from people from different countries. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I thought maybe we might talk about that a little bit of the social stigma attached to homelessness. I mean, that's one of the major issues, and I imagine that must play out in very particular ways in terms of people seeking help and of how they negotiate that relationship. So I don't know what your view is on the social attitude and its significance in terms of this problem.
It's a real problem, and sometimes when you're working with people, we prefer not to use the term homeless, the outsider. And we've had a number of education projects on for young children, people in transition year. Who is the outsider in my family, on my street, in my church, in my job? To try and get people to look at who just doesn't fit in. And it could be somebody who is a millionaire, it could be somebody who is nothing, and to try and challenge people. But often you can be seen in the same light. You can be as much an outsider as the people you're working with. And up to a few years ago, I had an old landlord who used to invite me out to lunch every Christmas, and it was always a big event. And then he had a friend one day, he said to me, "Well, what do you call those people, Alice?" And I said, "People." But he said, "You must call them something." And I decided the easiest thing was walk away because he just couldn't understand. And there is that stigma. And I think very often the professions make it even worse, because somebody who comes in is labelled homeless, then they're treated as being homeless, and it's shocking.
Yeah.
And that isn't changing.
Yeah.
It's
Is
not
that your
gonna-
Not
experience
at
as well?
all. No, I think it's actually getting worse.
It
I think
is.
people are really labelled. So they're labelled, you're an addict. So you're, you're mentally ill. And within that label, the person is gone. They suddenly, and even to try and shake off that label is difficult because it's been put upon them, and sometimes it can be a comfort blanket to say, "Oh, well, I'm an addict and I can't help myself." So you're disempowering people by giving labels the whole time. So exactly as you say, they're people. That's how we treat people the whole time, is they're equal to us. We're just doing a job to help these people move a bit closer to what they consider as happiness, or making sure their health is a bit improved, or maybe take that step forward to just them having a little bit of a better life, or a safer life, or a longer life, actually, is part of it. Because a lot of our work is actually keeping people alive and saving them because their health is so seriously compromised.
That's something when we had a chance to talk about these questions, or the two aspects of it that we might pursue. But one is the challenge of rehumanizing people because they've been living under the most difficult conditions, and where the social attitude is contributing to that. So how does that process work? How do you find and cultivate the humanity of someone who's living in distressing conditions?
Well, everybody has an interest in something outside of their experience of homelessness. So you just got to find that connection, whatever it may be. Because we work and live in the residential, we get to be around our clients 24/7. So within that, you just find your basic commonality, your basic humanity. Everybody has it. Sometimes it's just literally a smile. Sometimes it's looking somebody in the eye. But it's also finding ways, providing ways within the environment that can actually bring out a person's individual humanity and interest. So, for example, we have a pool table that was donated to us. So we played a lot of pool in the hostel. The staff, whenever they have a few minutes to spare, they would play pool with the men. For those few minutes, they're just people playing pool. We also had a colony of cats come to us about 10 years ago at the back of the hostel. And a few of the staff, including myself, are animal lovers, so we kind of didn't chase them away, and they didn't move. They're still there to this day. There's about 8 of them. And 3 weeks ago, the men built little houses out the back for the cats to keep them warm during the summer. And for us, it's a total avenue to see the humanity in that man. So he may be a person who's completely shut down, completely broken, maybe not even a very particularly chatty or easy person to be around. And he has an opportunity to go at the back, and there's cats. And suddenly, he's a person with a cat on his lap. He's like everybody else. It also teaches empathy. So the men would come and say, "Donna, Ginger's limping there, you need to get a vet straight away." And while that's annoying because I've more things to be doing than trying to find a vet for a cat, it's actually wonderful because it's taking somebody outside their own life and looking at somebody else, because that's what you want to do. You want people to forget they're homeless for a couple of minutes during the day. While you work with somebody to work them out of homelessness, when you have to key work and you have to do processes and procedures and be professional, to me, one of the most important parts is just finding the equality, that sense of humour, shared music, from the same county, whatever. It's our role to find that.
Yeah, I find that now we're a day facility, so we can't have cats, but we have a fish tank, and but it's interesting because some of the very withdrawn people, they won't mix, and you can see them looking at the fish, and then if every so often somebody will say maybe you're short a fish or a fish died, and then we have lyric music. And the lyric music is, and then there'll always be somebody there who will like the music. But I think sport, and I'm a real armchair sports fan, and I follow everything. The sad thing now, I think, is when the Dub footballers won there. Of course, they've been winning all the time, and you go in and there's nobody there to talk about it. But when the hurling this year, and when Joe Canning was there and he was ready to score, and Limerick won, and they were superb, but nobody mentioned it. But there was one man we hadn't seen for a while. He was from Limerick, and he came in, and he said, "Did you see it, Alice? Did you see it?" And I didn't know what he was talking about, and he said, "Oh, it was great. I was up in the Joy." And he said there was nobody else watching it, so he said, "And I watched Joe Canning, and I thought," and I won't say what he said, but it was great, and it got everybody and one of the saddest things we had, Jimmy, I mentioned in the book, Jimmy was reared in Keogh Square in Dublin, and he was reared by his granny, and he was a great soccer player. And one of the saddest things in my life, he lived in a skipper under Shamrock Rovers, where they played, and he had a skipper there, and he had the picture of the Sacred Heart, and he had a rosary beads, and he had something for this girlfriend who had died. But anyway, the saddest thing was when Ireland, it's a few years ago, I don't know what match it was, but it was one of the big soccer matches, and we were inside in a pub looking at it, and he was sitting outside on the street. And Charlie, my husband, saw him, and he went out and he brought him out a pint. That wouldn't be allowed these days. But you could see the difference then, and he loved sport, and he probably would have made the Irish team if he had the opportunities then. And
your sporting enthusiasms come through in the book as well.
Yes,
so you're still cheering for Tip, I guess, and you're that's good. It gives plenty to talk about. Well, I think those forms of humanization are absolutely crucial, because I think you were saying you can also build from them. It's a reminder to people as well of something that can be cultivated and used.
Absolutely. Make people remember what they used to be. Everybody was a child at one stage and they enjoyed something in their life. So it's just to make people to remember beyond their label, remember to live in the moment as well, because sometimes moments can be joyous. I agree with you completely about the sport. It's the one thing we disagree on. I hate sport. I have no interest.
Well, then you have your skills.
Yes. So what we would do is, when the World Cup is on, or when there's matches on, or anything like that on, we'll set the two tellies. We'll put the two tellies on, and we'll buy crisps and Coke and whatever, and we'll sit down and we'll watch the matches with them. They're very, very important, just to make people feel ordinary. Just have ordinary conversations. You know, ordinary people talk about their husbands, their wives, their jobs. So you just got to find different ways to talk about this, because those kind of conversations can be upsetting to somebody, because you might be reminding them of something that they don't want to remember. So you just got to find ways to be a good
Donna, can I just interrupt you there? Do you mind?
No, please.
Because one of the things that we've noticed, and I'm sure you do too, men in particular, if they're separated or their children are, and we meet more men than women, but if they had children and they're not in touch with them, that's a huge sadness in people's lives. And of course, women, you know, and if they have children in care, and that is a whole area that really needs to be dealt with much more humanely.
Absolutely great. Yeah, we would see it as quite detrimental for the men, that kind of pain, that they have the guilt, that they have the loss. And sometimes they can have very unrealistic expectations of seeing their children again. So we would be honest and say, well, you need to take steps to see your children again in the way that you want to see them. And we use that as an encouragement. So we try and, you have to try and flip everything on its head. And I think that's a fear, or they feel is ways to punish themselves. They need to punish themselves. We try and take that away from them and say, no, well, actually, you can have that, but this is the road. Let's go down this road. Guide them that way.
And you facilitate, I think, communication in some ways. I think you were talking about cards, people writing cards to family members, just as ways of re-establishing contact.
Yes, for Christmas what we do is we buy boxes of Christmas cards and pre-stamp them. So if somebody wants to send a Christmas card home, it's the easiest way to do it, because to write a letter you have to put some thought and feelings and reason into it, and that can be really scary. So Christmas card is a Christmas card. The greeting says it inside, so you just have to write something. So we make it easy for the men not to go down to shops and not to have to go through all that. There it is. While you have that moment, do it.
Well, we find this terrible sadness around Christmas time. Now, people, I think Irish people are amazingly generous, generosity people, and people in the media who are so good around Christmas time and highlight different issues. But there was a man we knew who was reared in Glencree, in the institution there. And that's a long time ago. And I remember one time we gave him a birthday card, and he came down and he said, would you mind that for me, because I have no place to put it. But we find that people get desperately upset at Christmas time, so we try to keep it as normal as possible. And I saw on the paper yesterday where Cleary's, they're doing up something in the Christmas window, and it reminded me of Gloria, a woman who was homeless in Dublin. And when the dogs were dancing in the window, I don't think they ever had them in Switzer's, or in BT's, but when the dogs were dancing in the window, and she told people, well, I was dancing with the dogs in Cleary's, and nobody understood what was going on, but it was, she was looking at them, at the dogs, and they were dancing. And we have to be very careful, I think, how when people tell us something, they mightn't say it in the way we might be used to hearing it, but there's probably something great going on at the back of it. Can I just say that the title of my book is The Stars Are My Only Warmth, and that's from Tony, who was a street poet, and he was set alight one night and taken to hospital, came down to us the next day. He walked out of hospital, we took off his shirt and his back was badly burned, but he was in poor health, and he died a few months after. He's buried in our plot in Glasnevin, but somebody put his poems together, and the title is from one of his poems, The Stars Are Only Warmth. It kind of says a lot.
It does.
And you would come across so many people who would write poetry.
Oh, absolutely, and musicians, marvelous, very creative people, I would find, and I suppose they need to be survivors, but one of the greatest things that I find with the work is, what the public generally see would be people maybe in their addiction or hiding away. In our line of work, we get to see the full circle of the human being. And I think that's the best, certainly the best and rewarding part for me is to see the talents come out, is to see the beauty that people have inside them, how they express themselves, their humanity. Absolutely. And one of the ways of doing that is giving people back skills. So you've got to try and find. So, for example, we wouldn't know somebody's a musician, perhaps, unless they told us, or we left a guitar lying around in the building. So we have had guitars donated, or we bought guitars, and we've had music nights. And the amazing talent that is there, and even if it's not very talented, it doesn't matter, it's good fun.
And it's their music.
And it's their music, it's their time, it's their space, and we're all just people, again.
And how do you, just specifically about the holidays, how do you, because you were saying you're 24/7, so how would you manage that?
Okay, Christmas Day, we have a big meal. About 3/4 of our clients would stay with us on Christmas Day. Some would go home, hopefully to visit their families or whoever, or a friend, and maybe come back that night or the next night. We ensure that all the men have gifts on Christmas morning, because if you're going to have a Christmas dinner, you have to have a Christmas gift. And also to encourage, not even to encourage, but to support them, and if they do want to link back in with their families, is that we've arranged with other charities and such to have appropriate Christmas gifts for kids or for their mothers or whomever. We have them ready. So we try and make it as easy as possible if they want to engage in Christmas. If they don't engage in Christmas, they can just go up to the room that's not decorated. You know, so I just...
In terms of, I'm interested in how long the relationships can be in some cases. I imagine some are short, but some possibly quite long, and you've alluded to this, Alice. So it'd be interesting for us to know.
Some people, we may meet them once or twice, and then they disappear. Others, you meet them, and there are a number of men in particular who drop into us regularly. It's their kind of place. They come in, they maybe read the paper, they have a shower, which can be very important, have their feet treated. We would encourage people to use the state services. I mean, we would in no way be allowing GPs or nurses or hospitals off the hook. We would say, look, these services are there, you shouldn't be treated any differently. And we would encourage people to use the services that are there. But very often, somebody who has disappeared, and they might come back after 10 years. I was giving a talk one day in the College of Surgeons out in Sandyford. They had a group of people out there. And I said, well, sure, you know where we are now, and do drop in. And this man came up to me afterwards, and he said, well, no, Alice, I won't be calling in. And I thought, God, he's nasty. But it so happened, he said, you met me, he said, when I was sleeping outside the GPO. Now, I'd forgotten completely about that, because you do forget. And he got his life together. He was in a very good job. So you never know. Yeah. And I think that's what makes the work interesting. Somebody who disappears. And I think it's important to allow people to disappear. Yeah. You know, people are independent human beings, and I think it's not good creating a dependency. Yeah. That doesn't help anyone. In fact, if you're doing that, you're only maybe helping yourself rather than helping the people. But that's where the professionalism comes into it.
Yeah. For you, Donna, duration of
again, it could be a very short contact, but generally it's longer. I suppose Galway is quite a small city. Yeah. So the relationships can be quite intense with people at times. So just what you said there about the lady or the man recognising it, absolutely, we forget, I suppose, as workers how important we actually are to people. And every now and again we need to be reminded that, you know, we're part of it. It's part of our job. So people come and go to us, but you have to try and remember the whole time. Each time you meet a person, you as the person who's been warm to them, who's greeting them, who's making them feel welcome, you're making an impression on them, and you want to make that impression last. But then they leave. But sometimes you forget that they take a little part of you with them. They remember you. I was just thinking back on your story. I was at a party a few years ago, a house party, and there was this quite good-looking young man, and he kept staring at me, and I was thinking, it's life in the old dog, yes. Nice. And then I was looking at him, and I thought, but Jesus, he's awful familiar. And what he came over to me at the end of the night, and I'd known him about 3 or 4 years earlier, and he did not look the way he looked that night. He looked a hell of a lot healthier. But he remembered me. He remembered everything I'd said to him, which I hadn't remembered. And he said that it was actually a brilliant opportunity to see me again. I was drunk as a lord, so it was actually quite embarrassing. Oh, really? Wow. But you just don't know, and that really taught me a lesson. Oh God, sometimes we do have an impact, whether we know it or not. Yeah. And I know when I started off in my early days of working in this area, I went to a talk, and one of the men that was speaking was a man that had been homeless for a long time and had addiction problems for a long time. And at this point, he was sober and in a steady home. And I walked up to him, I said, I'm just starting out on this path, this career. What do I need to know? And he said, never forget that your words will always stick. One day, keep talking to us, because one day the penny will drop. And I think they were the wisest words I ever heard in relation to my career, and I've used it the whole way. That it mightn't appear that you're making an impression on somebody, it mightn't appear that you're getting through to somebody, it might appear that they're actually quite angry and hostile to you. Doesn't matter. Next time, try it again, and try it again, and try it again. And I have found over the years that approach has certainly worked with people when you're building that humanity, when you're building that foundation.
Yeah. Can I ask you both about an important aspect of how you run things, and it relates to alcohol and drugs. So how do you manage that? You're obviously dealing with people who, for a variety of reasons, may have addictions. And maybe part of their way of managing the situation that they're in. So how is that dealt with?
Well, people don't drink or take drugs in our centre. No. But if people come in and they have, for instance, when people come to us, we don't, we keep no information on people on the computer. We just ask people their name, what country they came from, where they stayed last night. Now, the only reason we do that, and we have at the end of it, we have that we tell them this information is only used for our own information. We don't give out any. And so that at least we know what we're dealing with. And people, if they come to us for the first time, if they're very drunk, as long as they're not causing any problems to other people. And if somebody is very difficult, we say to them, we just call them aside, we have a chat with them, and we say, look, we can't run our centre and we can't meet your needs if this is what's happening. And if you want to talk about it, or if you want to think about it. And we also, if people come and they're complaining about the services, and rightly so, but sometimes people expect us to deal with the problem rather than helping them to deal with it themselves. And maybe they can come in and be very angry and very nasty. And we would just simply say, well, look, can you understand how that person you're meeting, how she copes with you if you're behaving like that? You know, that this kind of behaviour isn't helping you. And by just chatting around it, it can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And a simple thing, like when you have a shower, put your towel in the bin. It's a very simple thing, but you know, people are just used to. And then people tell each other, look, you leave things clean. That's about having respect. And it's not about any high-powered courses or anything like that. It's just very basic, and that helps them to because sometimes people can be very angry of how they're, and rightly so. But I always say, well, look, if you jump over the counter, the guards will be called, and you'll have a bigger problem. So, you know, it's.
Yeah. How do you, and of course, because you're residential, presumably it's could be more acute question, I suppose, in relation to drugs and alcohol. And
well, we don't allow alcohol or drugs in the building, but certainly people come into the building under the influence of alcohol and or drugs. Everything is based on behaviour. So if a person is quite aggressive at the gate under the influence, we'll ask them to come back later on. Because the hostel is a place of peace and quiet and sanctuary. Yeah. But we wouldn't be doing a job if we didn't work with people who are in addiction. That's where they're at, and that's what we'll work with. Yeah. So we do have helpful services, great services that come in. We've a homeless substance misuse workers that are shared between ourselves and Galway Simon. We have linkages in with the methadone clinic. So we work with people while they're in addiction. We work to harm reduction, which is where we basically don't ask for abstinence, but we look at reducing the harms themselves. And in reducing the harms themselves, you sometimes reduce harm to society as well. So we kind of help decrease their criminality, which helps them, but also helps society. So it's a fact of our working life. It's what we do. People have addictions.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about, because Alice, you mentioned that people who particularly when you were starting out, often coming from institutions, and it just raises that question about family background as a contributing dimension of that experience. I don't know if either of you could talk about that side of people that you work with.
You mean the family they came from?
Or the institutional background in terms of broader social problems, which then manifest themselves in a thing which then may be blamed on the person who is living with the consequences, so to speak.
Well, I think everything goes back to childhood, I think, and the opportunities, the lack of opportunities, being loved and cared for. And it's very difficult on families. I mean, as we speak now, I know there's a march in Dublin today, and I saw the name of poor Jonathan Corrie mentioned again, but we knew Jonathan well. And we contacted his mother, who really was deeply upset when she saw some of the commentary from people who didn't know him or her, and the work that they had all put into him. But a man we knew who died in Stephen's Green 2 years, last year, I think, the years are just flying, but he used to come in to us, he would have drugs taken, he would sit there quietly, he was no problem. And we hadn't seen him for a while, he came back in, and Matt, who works with me, he shaved him, gave him a change of clothes, cup of coffee, and he died that night in Stephen's Green. And then we discovered he had started drinking at 13 years of age with his mother. And the guards gave me the number of his family to contact, and it was such a tragic family, you know. It was so very. But then, on the other hand, you could meet somebody from a very well-to-do family, and things just went wrong. And the reality is, you never know, and people will tell you what they want to tell you, and that's their right. It's not up to any of us to put words in someone's mouth that they're saying what we want them to hear.
And your experience, Donna? Yeah.
I was just thinking there that when I was frontline work, I used to work nights, I'd be downstairs on my own, and some of the men would come in, and I particularly used to like speaking to the older men. But I remember them telling me about their experiences in Letterfrack, for example. And this would have been well before it would have come out in the media. And I was horrified, absolutely horrified. I didn't understand it. I didn't know, and I think a lot does come back to what happens in your childhood. You know, there are circumstances, of course, of some of the, you know, we have had examples of men having a breakdown or a marriage breakdown and just not able to cope. But sometimes the family is a very toxic place for various reasons, as you described, maybe through alcohol or abuse, or just generational poverty, or just society just never given certain people a chance. But certainly I think there is and it's, you know, it's come out in the last couple of years, there has been a very dark side to Ireland. And we've done some very cruel things to our children and our youth. And I think we're paying the price for it now. And I think my concern in the current climate is, what are we creating again? And making it worse. And that, to me, is the despair I have in the current homelessness, is that we're not only recreating the past in certain ways, but we're making it worse, because we're just adding on. We have children in the hostels, we have children in B&Bs, we have children unsupervised homeless. So what are we doing to them? What are we creating? What are we teaching them?
We really haven't addressed that at all. We have come across 4th generation. And when you look at last week, Donna, Brother Kevin's, a long queue, 300 people. I mean, I think it's appalling, mothers having to queue for nappies and food. And we have cut back on services. And, you know, and also there is so much, we do need red tape, we do need some of it, but it's almost unpolitically correct to give someone a hug or a tap on the shoulder. The very human things that we all do. And there's no, and I think it's marvellous to be here today. I really would. I think it's great to be here in this part of the world. But I think particularly that is kind of the arts, because sometimes when we're talking about poverty, the questions you're asking wouldn't be asked maybe. You know, and there is no real debate taking place. And that has to take place if we're to go anywhere. And it should involve people themselves, too.
Absolutely. I think this whole situation of including housing with homelessness can sometimes blur the issue for the people experiencing homelessness. Because it's not just about a house. There are many other things you have to get into foundations first. And that's where, I suppose, the one thing that kind of worries me as well is how our culture has become a lack of community.
We've broken.
We used to know, you know, as you said
and
earlier,
the liberties, the community, and the liberties.
Absolutely, it's instilled. It's as you said earlier, it's genetic in me. It's instilled me this idea of you just keep an eye out for your fellow person, and that's it. You don't have to be a saint about it, but you just have to be not nasty or actively do something. But I think, as I say, the whole idea we can build houses and housing forces coming to Galway and all the rest of it, and that's fantastic. But there's something about society deeply needs to change as well. We need to take responsibility for those that aren't fortunate, and we need to take responsibility for our actions. What we do will have repercussions for other people, positive and negative.
That's a very important point, partly because as we emerge out of a long period of austerity and economic decline, in which people retrench, and they retrench emotionally and in a variety of ways, where are we going to go? Are we going to stick with that same attitude, or are we going to recover something at this moment? I think that's a question for everybody, in effect. I do want to see if there might be things that people want to raise in the audience, if we have a little bit of time here towards the end. Yes, I see a hand there.
Did you see anyone? I didn't see with the light.
No.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I have two questions actually, if that's okay. One is, I've only been in Galway for a relatively short time, but I do feel like I have seen more people on the street in the time that I've been here. And I wonder if you could speak to the scale of the homelessness crisis in Ireland. My second question is, Donna, you say it's so much more about putting a roof over someone's head. And with the issue of rehoming and rehabilitation, if that is not, say, your metric for success, do you have some other way that you know your impact in society? If it's not just about putting a roof over someone's head, or is it just, as you say, meeting people and hearing their stories after they've left? Do you have some kind of way that you know your services are making a difference?
It's very hard at this time because it can be quite overwhelming. The numbers are in Galway, are quite overwhelming at the moment, particularly in winter. Whereas you said, starting off, it's when it becomes more in people's consciousness, they're more visible. Again, it just goes back to me, if a person doesn't return, if we can move a person into accommodation, whether it be their own accommodation or an approved housing body, or to perhaps one of the transitional houses, and they don't return back to our service, which is the emergency service, then that's a success. But we also count our successes rather small as well. Perhaps for us it's just psychological that we have to do that as workers to keep going. But again, it's just about building on the person the whole time. So our ultimate success is for somebody to get a house and never need us again. But unfortunately, they're rather rare that happens. So you just keep chugging along. That's our successes, to be honest. And if we can make somebody a little bit more confident in themselves, if we can make somebody a bit more conscious about how important they are in this world, then we see that as a success until we have the housing. Then I would quantify different successes. But while there's nothing out there, it's very hard. Does that answer your question?
It's very hard. We can't see up here. You might wonder what you can see us, but we can't see you with the lights. Well, I think that what Donna has said is very important, because there's a huge. We are confusing. There are two very separate issues, and all the emphasis now, and there are huge issues around people needing housing. I mean, and if people had housing, it would solve their problem in many instances. But homelessness, and the people who traditionally became homeless and end up on the streets are the people we're talking about. And there is a danger that there is this mad rush to get figures. I mean, I often think a statistic is like a drunken man leaning against a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And that's a quote from a Scottish poet of over 100 years ago. And I think there is a huge rush for people to just become statistics and to gather statistics, and then you have solved the problem. And meanwhile, while you're doing that, you're ignoring maybe the very humane things that need to be done. And it's very hard to put a price on the value of a smile. It's much easier to put a price on the value of something else. And I think that's what's missing in the whole debate. Wouldn't you agree, Donna?
I think you put it perfectly, yes.
Yeah.
Including a good quote. I like that quote.
Yeah, you can.
We have a couple of other questions I see. Yeah, I saw you first. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for the insight. It's a little bit different hearing about the human stories rather than just statistics, and I think it's very useful. I find it useful for me anyway, and it's the empathy you show and the care you show for people it's encouraging and heartwarming for us. I'm a member of the city council, so as a local policy maker, I think it's important that this type of a forum is useful for that element of things. But in the opening remarks, there was comments made about how we're not building enough housing, and there is, and that's a larger debate, I think, and it's one that can be corrected with a political will. But what I'm hearing specifically from yourselves regarding homelessness is the people in addiction, the people with other problems other than just getting the roof over their heads. And you kind of, and the question I have is, you alluded to the loss of services and the need for services, and we'll all advocate for them, we all say they ought to be there. But from your experience and your expertise, what do we need to have that would solve the problem that you deal with every day? What level of services for addiction or for mental health would require to be there to minimize the amount of clients that you would have to deal with. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the areas, I think the whole mental health issue, that is a huge problem, huge. We shut down the institutions, and rightly so, but we always talk about community care. There isn't care in the community. There aren't enough services. Where do communities go if they have a problem and they want to get help? There's no help there. If you have somebody who is seriously mentally ill and needs to be in hospital, there's not a bed there. So that is one issue. What we really need too is, in Dublin, it's not fashionable to say we still need shelters. Of course we still need shelters. And something that we've noticed happening now is there are some people who are getting very low paid jobs, maybe in hospitality or whatever. They're working at night time, they can't get accommodation, and there isn't even a basic shelter where they could go and put their head down. So we are losing out on, there's very little common sense out there when we're talking about planning services. And very often the people who are planning the services are very far removed from what's on the ground. So it is a huge issue. And certainly the lack of social housing is a disgrace. The local authorities stopped building houses years ago. Then it was left to agencies to provide the housing, and they have to get the money to pay their staff. So there is something missing in the whole discussion, I think.
Yeah.
Or lack of discussion even.
Yeah. Donna, do you want to comment on that?
I think for Galway, there's certainly a lack of services for people with mental health and addiction issues. So, for example, with mental health, unless somebody's already connected into the mental health services, they can't be connected in to them without supports from psychiatric service or consultants or public mental health nurses, but it doesn't exist in Galway. We do have a community mental health nurse, but their remit can only work with people who are already within the mental health
And it's the
service.
same in Dublin, really.
Yeah, and if a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness don't or refuse to link in for whatever reasons with mental health services, or even sometimes acknowledge they have a mental health condition, which is the same as ordinary people who have homes. It's just the fact that their mental health or their families or whatever has just, the supports aren't there for them. So they slip through the cracks in the system and they end up homeless. There should be kind of some specialised way of thinking, like somebody who is an outsider. I think that's a very interesting word. Is, as you say, services aren't designed for people. They're designed for economics, they're designed for stats. They're not actually there to go out and meet people. I remember, I used to live in Amsterdam, I used to live in Holland, I walked dogs for a living. And this is where I first, as an adult, really thought about homelessness. And I used to walk to Rottweilers, so I walked all over the park, nobody missed. So there was a lot of rather open drug use within the park in Amsterdam. But I actually made friends with a lot of the people because I had no fear of them, but I also had, I was very interested, but I watched a white van come around 2 or 3 times a day. And I wondered, what was that van? And what it was a needle exchange, it was a methadone clinic, it was access and information about health services for people, and this is going back over 30 years ago. And I was stunned at the humanity of it. I couldn't believe that, that to me was smart. Go out and meet people where they're at, and then you can invite them in. It's so difficult to invite somebody from way over there to come on over and join us. It's much easier to drive the car over, get them in the taxi and get them back here. And the next time they need you, they'll know how to get there. Or you might meet them halfway. But I think to expect people who have a multitude of difficulties to fit into mainstream systems is horrendous.
Or if you have somebody who is seriously mentally ill or they appear at your service and then you're told, well, you can email and make an appointment.
Absolutely.
And then it's the guards have to end up picking up that person and then they end up with a criminal record.
Absolutely.
So, as you mentioned Amsterdam, I must mention it too, if it's okay, because I could have been there at the same time. I was in the red light area.
So was I. Were you in that coffee shop?
Was that you?
That was me, yeah.
I stayed with the Salvation Army there. But I always feel this woman on my shoulder when I'm doing something, and I think I was going through this sex place, and this woman grabbed me, and she pushed me in so I could smell, you know, the musty clothes and that. And she said, "You're Irish." I don't know how she knew. And she said, "You speak Irish." And she started speaking a bit of Irish to me, and I did. You know how when you're abroad, you kind of learn you think what you learned in school. And she was, you knew she was once a beautiful looking woman. And her parents were killed. She was from from the southeast, and her parents were killed. She was put into care. And she came out of care and she went to London, and she was very good looking. And then she got addicted to drugs, and then she got involved in the sex industry. And I'm sure she died shortly after that, but I always feel her, that you kind of, you know, she's there. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I think there's always somebody that touches you, that motivates you. And there's always, for me, there's throughout my life, even, I suppose, leading up to this point, there has always been people that stick out in my memory. Even before I got into this kind of line of work, there's always been people who I've either been attracted to or indeed attracted to me that are outside society, that there's something they need. I think, bringing it back around to the beginning, I think just not only do, I suppose, people like ourselves have an eye for other people, certainly in my experience, people in need have an eye for me.
And you're going to attract.
Absolutely. They know.
Time for another question. There's just one more, and just we have somebody at the front there. Yeah, thanks.
I'm just wondering that living in the real world of today, which is computer-led and phone-led, and you know, that how do we reconnect the real humanity to man? You know, that we're storing up more problems because the young people, not only the young people, I mean, but the isolation that people feel because, you know, they think they're connected with the real world because I can put on a screen, I can go over, I need never leave my house, and I can have every service to me, whereas I'm not meeting people. And also we'll say the common sense approach that Alice talks about. I remember in the 70s living in Bedsit in Dublin my first time from home, and delighted, absolutely, I was in Clover. You know, now that wouldn't be allowed today, you know, because you wouldn't have the facilities and health and safety. And how can we get back to a real world, you know, where common sense can be used?
Again. Yeah. I am not a great lover of technology, so I completely agree. I think, you know, doing this is not the same as what we're doing right now, and I think that's the start of it. We have to start talking again. I think we have to start being friendly again. I think the one thing I would have noticed myself is that people don't really look each other in the eye and say hello anymore. So I might see somebody walking down the road 3 times a week as I go up and down to work or whatever, and we don't make eye contact. So I personally am the type of person, if I meet you more than a few times, I'll say hello. So I think we need to get back to that. I think we need sports. I agree with you. I think sports is an amazing way for people to reconnect. And I think people to get back to community, but I think our loss of community centres and those kind of spaces, we don't have the space to reconnect anymore. We used to have the heart at home. We could tell our stories and somebody would come to the house or whatever. Now it's all pubs, and we always had pubs, but at least we spoke them before. Now it's all just music. So I think we just need to remember, I think what the Irish are great for, which is actually connecting to people and talking to people. But I think it's basically just having a look around and smiling at people.
And being courageous too, and being, you know, not be afraid to say it as it is. I mean, I would like to think I'm living in the real world as well as, because homelessness is about the real world, very much the real world. But I think very often we all want to be nice and to just say all the right things and to be cool, as they say. But I think we need to just kind of say what exactly do you mean, you know, and be honest and open and not be afraid to, because I think an awful lot of people are afraid to just say it as it is. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be nasty or whatever. I mean, you can, but I'm going to use another quote now, and she's from Somerset Maugham. And he said, somebody asked him, had they the answer to something? And he said, well, I'm at an age now when it's all right to say, I don't know. So I don't know if that's been of any help.
It's a good place to draw to a close. I wanted to read one paragraph, if that's okay, from Alice's book. And it's just to indicate the nature of what she's done and what people working in this area have done. It's lovely, something from page 180. When I took off those stiff leather shoes in the 70s, the feet were often rubbed raw and sore. Today, the foot conditions are every bit as bad, as people tend to wear soft runners that make their feet sweat more. The smell of rotting skin came at me from feet that were white and wrinkled, a different color from their legs, after days spent in sodden, wet socks. Sometimes tight socks would cut off the circulation and feet would be painfully bloated and swollen. I would fill my enamel basin with warm water and add a good helping of salt to try and harden the jelly soft skin. That's an extraordinary contribution. I'd like to thank you both for the work that you do, for being here today, for talking to us and shedding so much light on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Tell them it's on sale, the book.